Hello and welcome to the podcast According to Sci-Faith, where we discuss topics revolving around the compatibility of science and faith. I'm Joshua Göcking and you're listening to According to Sci-Faith. Episode 59, Entropy. So entropy is one of those quantities which are really sometimes thought to be difficult to understand, not because they are itself difficult to understand or nobody understands them in this way, but because they are really abstract in what they are or what this quantity is, and therefore it's sometimes difficult to understand what it really is, and trying to illustrate it sometimes leads to to misunderstandings. So, for example, if you have temperature, it's pretty easy to understand what it is or to get a feeling for what it is. Everyone kind of knows what temperature is. We know when it's warm or when it's cold, and that is basically corresponding with temperature. But if we look at what temperature physically really is, then we see temperature actually is the average speed with which the particles or the atoms in where we are moving around. So if they are really on average moving really fast, then it's really warm, and if they are moving slowly, then it's getting colder. So this is basically what it is. But if you would use this image and you would try to understand what temperature is, if you try to understand what temperature is, or you see a temperature value and try to understand, is it warm or is it cold, you don't think of the speed of particles because you do not see these particles flying around, but you think of how it feels. Do you feel warm? Do you feel cold? You measure it in this way. And of course, there is a correlation to that. The particles moving fastly means they hit you a lot, basically, and therefore it feels warmer to you than when they don't move so fast, and so on. So there is this correlation, but still, it would be too abstract for you to understand every time you see, okay, it's such and such degrees outside to always think, okay, this means the particles are moving at that speed. Or, so to speak, if we would just instead of temperature, use the average speed of the particles with which they are flying around. At some time you might get used to this new unit, but you would still think, okay, if the particles are moving at that average speed, that feels like this, and then you would still have this your own feeling of what temperature is, and not the physical definition of what temperature is, or the physical interpretation of what temperature on a particle level actually is. And here with entropy, it's the same way, but there we actually only have the physical statement, the physical interpretation of what entropy is, and in some senses we can describe how it pans out in the real world, so to speak, in our world that we experience every day. But because this is not as directly as with temperature, it's a little bit more difficult to understand it. And what entropy is, or how you can define entropy, is by counting the available microstates of a system. What is a microstate? A microstate is basically the location and the momentum of a particle. Momentum is then basically the velocity of this particle. So these combined quantities combine a microstate that the particles can be in. And there are several microstates that these particles can have, because I mentioned temperature. So if in a room there's a temperature of, let's say, 20 degrees, then that means on average the particles there are moving at a certain speed. And this means, however, of course, that this speed is an average. So there are particles who are moving faster and there are particles who are moving slower, and on average this certain speed comes out. Therefore, it is the case that is not just one microstate that is available with one speed and maybe many different locations. It's not just this plane of microstates, but there are many different microstates also that are available, who are statistically, of course, distributed. And the rule is that all these available microstates in a system, that they are all filled up, and this basically means that the entropy will increase in changes of the system. So, for example, if we have diffusion processes, for example, we have two boxes and we have a wall between them, and in the one box there are many atoms moving around fastly, in the other there are almost no atoms. Then if I remove the wall, then it won't take long until all these microstates who are currently free in this empty box are filled up. And so this entropy is basically increasing. This is what's meant by when the entropy is increasing. And what you can see from this also is you have these two boxes. Once I have opened the wall, removed the wall and opened it up, then it's basically the new state is basically the one in which it will remain on. I cannot just put the wall back in or wait until the particles are moving back into just the one box and move the wall back in and I get the same state as I was in before. No, that will just not happen, and therefore this is also what's meant by an irreversible process. So these processes, you cannot reverse them to their initial state, only by applying energy, but without that you cannot get them to this initial state. And this is also meant by the entropy increasing. So the initial state will not return to this initial state. And this also shows what entropy is really responsible for, because it's responsible for this arrow of time, because that these processes are not reversible means that time can only move in one direction. Because if you have learned about, let's say, this theory of relativity, and then you have learned that time is just a dimension like space, then you might have asked, okay, in space I can go forward and I can go backward. In space I can go left and I can go right. I can go up and I can go down. But in time, I can only go forward. I can only go in one direction. Why is that? If time is a dimension like space, why is it that time only goes into one direction? And it's actually the case because of these irreversible processes, these processes that cannot be turned around, because in space you can turn everything around, you can reverse everything, but here it is not possible to reverse these states, and therefore time can only move into one direction. And this is the reason for this is basically entropy. And there is also an alternative, or there are alternative ways to interpret entropy. I think one of the pretty common ones is to see it as the disorder in a state, that states move from order to disorder. And in one sense that is true, because if you look again at these two boxes, you might call the first state where it's all in one box and in the other there's nothing, where you might call this more ordered, and if you open it up then it's in a state of more disorder. But this can quickly lead to misconceptions or misunderstandings, that you then say, okay, it's just like my room. If I don't clean it up oftentimes, then it will just get more and more messy and more disorder, and this is just the same as entropy. There might be some relation there. It's not completely unrelated, of course, but that's not actually what entropy is all about. And it's more something like these diffusion processes that I've described, and they can be described by counting these microstates. However, Leonard Susskind, about whom we talked also in the last episode, had a different interpretation of this, and he calls it entropy to be a hidden information. And he says it's in the same way where we have these microstates, you need to know them to really understand what's going on behind it, but you cannot know them because there are so many, and therefore you count these microstates, these possible microstates, and use them as a quantity you call entropy, because you cannot describe the system any further than that, because it's just too messy, it's just too big. So there is hidden information. This information that you do not know about is hidden from you because it's impossible to know all this, and therefore you can describe entropy also as hidden information. Okay, time for a short break. In these breaks, I usually make some announcement as you are used to by now. And I think one announcement is that this post that I was talking about in one of the episodes about the consistent histories interpretation, this is now on my Substack, so you can read all about that. Also, if you are also following the German Substack, then you just stay updated about it, because there might be some changes over the holidays. So over the holidays I will take some time, consider how to continue with the podcast, with my Substack and so on, and also with my writing. So there will be some changes probably, and I will announce them once I made them. So really keep updated there. And if you are interested in reading my books, then I really can recommend to you my book Sci-Faith, The Compatibility of Science and Faith. This is available as an ebook in English, so I really recommend you to get that. And if you want to read a novel, then I really recommend to you Alien Thoughts, my first novel, a science fiction novel, so you can read all about that. It's also available as an ebook, so I recommend you to get that one. And really, if you have read those books and you really enjoyed them, then I really would like if you could give a short review, either just a 5-star review, or just you can also write something about it, what you find especially intriguing, what you like the most, and so on. I really like to hear your feedback and get to know what you think of my work. And also I have this book, The Odysseus-Liste, which is right now only available in German. It's a crime novel, and in the coming year I really plan to translate this also into the English language. If you would be interested in this, then just let me know, then I will try to speed up this process and try to get this available to you also. Having now understood what entropy really is, or at least I hope you got some kind of idea what entropy is, we can state something which is called the second law of thermodynamics. And this is basically saying that the entropy always increases. So in any system there might be systems where you can reduce entropy because you do work on the system and so on. But if you take the system as a whole, then it will always increase in entropy. So if you take entropy in one part of the system out of the system, then you will add it in another one, and altogether it will be at least zero or even increase. So the entropy of the universe is always increasing, and this basically it comes from the fact that we have these irreversible processes. This comes from the fact that we have these cases where the diffusion processes go on in one direction but cannot be returned to the initial condition, initial state. And this is also shows that there cannot be something like a perpetuum mobile, so something like a machine that just produces energy. This is also here, and there have been many attempts to contradict it, or to find something which contradicts that, or which shows that this law is not true. And one of them is Maxwell's demon. And this is basically, if you think back to our example where we had those two chambers, or to this box with these two chambers and a wall between them, and then let's just say we have this wall and this can be opened up by some kind of demon, and this demon will open the up only once this from one side the particle comes to the other side in such a way that it will increase order, and on the other hand, so to speak, to reduce entropy. And then it will open up the box, the wall, and let a particle through, and then close it up again, that if the other particles who want to move to the state of disorder, that they don't get out. This is basically the assumption that we say, yeah, this way entropy would be reduced and so on. But if you look at this problem more closely, then you will see that the demon itself is basically increasing in entropy because he's reducing the entropy there. And by doing this, by his efforts in this sense, he is increasing in entropy. Another way where you can see this is something that Richard Feynman was postulating, or what was talking about in his Feynman lectures. There he talks also about this, and he talks about he basically has a wheel, so actually a cogwheel, and in this cogwheel he has a mechanism that blocks the cogwheel to go only into one direction. And when he then states, okay, only the particles who will push this cogwheel into this direction can move this cogwheel, and therefore I can have this perpetuum mobile, because the particles are randomly flowing around into all directions, of course, but only the ones who move the cogwheel in the direction I want it to be moved in, only those will contribute, and therefore I will have my perpetuum mobile. What he considers this then more closely, and he comes to the conclusion that this won't work because the thing that's blocks this clocking wheel is basically once when the particles move the wheel in the right direction, that there will be a split second, let's say, in which this blockage of this cogwheel will be free. And in this time, there might be, or there will then be, particles coming from the other direction, which will pull it back into the wrong direction. So, and on average, this will even out, and then you will not achieve this perpetuum mobile. This is the idea he had, and this is the way he solved it. And therefore, you can see that anytime anytime this law holds true, this is one of the laws where you can really be sure that it is true, because it has been proven many times. All these kinds of Gedanken experiments where this seems to be not the case could have been disproved, and also all the patents that have been brought in about such perpetuum mobile could all be shown to do not what they stating they would do. And I think from a gut feeling, it also seems right that this entropy has to increase, because we all know that something like a perpetuum mobile is something like a pipe dream, and that this is nothing real, and therefore this is well established and shows that our world, how our world is. I think you get a deeper understanding of how our world is, how our world functions. Also, you get this the importance of it, that we have this time direction defined by entropy, that we have a time arrow, that we cannot just go forward and backward in time, which I think is pretty good actually, and therefore you see why it is necessary, and you see how nature works in this way. I think in the spiritual we can interpret this in certain ways. One is that, as we see with entropy, all the microstates that are available are really filled up. And I think this is also pretty interesting, that it is a principle of this universe, that all the states that are available are filled up, that basically everything that is possible will in some sense happen. And I think this is also in the spiritual, that everything that is available to us, we can have it, that all the promises that God has made to us, we can achieve them, we can receive them if we just receive them by faith. And what this principle of entropy also shows us is that something that once it is together, once it is diffused, basically some such diffusion process, then you cannot separate it anymore. Then you would really need to use much energy to separate it again. And I think this also shows that once we are one with God, where if we enter into this oneness with God, then we cannot separate it from him anymore. He says in the Bible, it says that nothing can separate us from his love, and this is basically just the fact that we are one with him and we cannot separate it from him anymore. So if you have just like you have these diffusion processes where two mediums are coming together and then they cannot be separated anymore from each other, you can have this with God, that you become one with him, and then nothing can separate you from him anymore. So that's everything for today's episode. I hope you liked it and you enjoyed each part of it. If you want to get in touch with me or discuss a topic or want to give me some feedback, then feel free to contact me using the contact form on my website, sci-faith.de/en. And there you can go to the contact tab and contact me. And if you have any other things or episodes you want to have covered there or topics you want to have covered, feel free to contact me there. Also, if you are not yet familiar with the format in which this podcast is produced, let me just briefly explain it to you. So there is always at the beginning of a month or of a block, there is a big block of 4 episodes in one thing. It's kind of like a preview, which I call it, where you have the next 4 episodes all in one episode together, combined. And this is for people who like to hear long format podcasts, who have a long way to work or something else, where they can listen to a long episode and can then have a preview of the next 4 episodes all at once, and are completely up to date from the beginning of the block. For those who like their episodes shorter, who prefer it if they have a half an hour or even less of a podcast episode, for those there is every week afterwards will appear a podcast episode almost in that length, and this way I can publish every week a new podcast every episode, and everyone can have it his own way, either once a month a long chunk of content, or once a week a shorter format podcast episode. So I think that's the best way for everyone, and also for me when I'm producing it. Please also note that this is an independent podcast, which means that it is recorded, produced, and marketed by me. So I really need your support in this. So if you like this podcast, then give it a 5-star rating. And if you have the time, even write a review to it. This just helps other listeners to become aware of this podcast. And then people who might be interested in this content can become aware of it. Also, if you have friends who you think would like this content, then recommend it to them and share it with them. Also, you can support me in other ways, for example by reading my blog and subscribing to my newsletter, or even by reading my books, which you can find on Amazon. For example, there is my latest novel out now is Alien Thoughts, which is pretty entertaining from the feedback that I gotten, and so it's also in some way related to science and faith. The topic of it is also in there, but of course you can also read the book to this podcast, Sci-Faith, The Compatibility of Science and Faith, which is also available in English since last year. Thank you for that. And now I wish you a wonderful day, and I'm looking forward for you to tune in again next time.